Welcome. This is the Eco-Modernist Podcast. Our philosophy is based on sound science and free from the outdated dogmas of the 20th century.
This is the Eco-Modernist Podcast, and my name is Rick Maltese.
And I'm Phil Ord.
I have with us Dr. Wade Allison. He's the Emeritus Professor of Physics from Oxford University, a Fellow of Keble College. He has taught for over 40 years. He published Fundamental Physics for Probing and Imaging in 2006, which is an advanced textbook for his course at Oxford on physics and medicine and the wider environment. He is most famous for his book, Radiation and Reason, The Impact of Science on a Culture of Fear. He has a new book, which we are about to discuss, entitled Nuclear is for Life, A Cultural Revolution. I want to start by just briefly discussing your intent with the various books when you publish them.
Well, there's 3 books altogether. There's starting with the Fundamental of Physics for Probing and Imaging, which was a student book for my course. So at the end of writing that book, I gave a popular lecture to the alumni of my college, and I was surprised, first of all, that they knew absolutely nothing about nuclear or radiation. So I set about doing that, and that came out in 2009. And in 2011, of course, the Fukushima accident occurred, and the book was very interesting. It was rapidly translated into Japanese, and I've been over there 4 times. But at the end of that sequence, I realized, first of all, I'd learned a lot more. I'm not a biologist, but I've spent a great deal of time studying it and talking with doctors and oncologists and the like.
So I particularly like your subheadings in the titles. You say Radiation Reasoning, the subtitle, The Impact of Science on a Culture of Fear. We have people that are generally frightened that we meet every day that are not aware of radiation.
Radiation, even in its ionizing form, is really pretty harmless. In fact, compared with fire and biological risks, radiation is almost no risk. And people think we don't know about this sort of thing, but we've been using radiation in medicine for over 100 years, and not low doses of radiation, but actually high and very high doses of radiation for people's health. It's just that they haven't taken on board the fact that this is the same radiation, the same kind of effect as you get in the environment from a reactor, even when it goes wrong.
What is non-ionizing radiation?
Ionizing radiation is hard enough to be able to break the molecules, in particular the DNA, but also the other molecules in your body if you shine on them. And non-ionizing radiation it's not powerful enough to do that. So all it can do is heat you. And we're familiar with this. If you go out into the sunshine, that is non-ionizing radiation.
So ionizing radiation pretty much begins at the UV spectrum, right?
Yeah. Like the microwave oven is a really good source of non-ionizing radiation. And it cooks the things that you put in it, but you're talking about 800 watts of radiation, whereas at Fukushima, you're talking about 10 to the minus 10 watts per kilogram, or 10 to the minus 11 watts per kilogram. Millionths of the amount of radiation. And
Yes.
There's nothing like enough of energy there overall to heat you, so you can't feel it,
right.
Which worries people, but that's because it's so weak.
You can be burned by radio waves and microwaves and even white light if you have enough quantity.
And you can be burnt by UV. There's 2 new things happen. One is that in the breaking of these molecules, you can kill the cells. Now that's different from just heating. So either the cells get replaced or they get mended and so on. The tissue is alive. It means it reacts and it does something when it's subjected to this sort of effect. And that's been happening to life from radiation and from oxygen for the last 3,000 million years. And this is the problem that life on Earth solved, to be able to survive radiation and oxygen.
I think it's a big misconception that radiation accumulates in our body.
It doesn't, any more than light or sunshine accumulates in your body. It can heat you, it can even cause skin cancer, but it doesn't hang around. It may leave some damage, and the question is what happens to the damage, but it goes through and out the other side.
That's interesting. So what about things like iodine that theoretically you have to take to avoid damage?
Well, you're talking there about radioactivity. Now, radioactive atoms are atoms which can and do slowly emit radiation. So it's the same problem, but you're looking at the source of the radiation being on you or in you or something. And if your name is Mr. Litvinenko and you've been given enough of it, you're in big trouble, but that's very rare.
So the substances, or I guess you could call them elements, that go into your body, depending on their properties, they'll stay long or they'll eventually get washed out or taken out of your body.
That's right. There are some that are in your body which have always been there. Potassium 40, which is a variant of the normal potassium that we have in our body. That's always been there since the beginning of the formation of the Earth, some 5, 6, 7,000 million years ago. And that gives you a constant dose of about 0.3 millisieverts per year, and that's there all the time.
Radiation doesn't accumulate. Radioactive substances can.
Oh, they can accumulate and they can be washed out and so on, but they don't do anything until they emit their radiation. That is what potentially causes the damage.
So what radioactive isotopes do people need to be worried about accumulating if there's a nuclear incident?
What people don't realize is they don't ask themselves the right question. They look at the people from Fukushima. How much cesium-137 did they accumulate? Tens of thousands of people have had the cesium-137. You look at what else we know. Well, there was this accident in 1987 in a place called Goiânia in Brazil. Goiânia, Goinia, you can look it up. The doses, the amount of radioactivity that those people got from cesium-137, exactly the same as people accumulate from Fukushima, but about 10,000 times more. 1987 is quite a long time ago. We can ask the question, how many of those people died of cancer? 4 of them died of acute radiation syndrome, but none of them have died from radiation from cancer. It's really very surprising.
If you get a lethal dose of radiation, you don't get cancer and die, you just die.
Basically, the biology of the cell cycle gets suspended and the normal maintenance of your body packs up and your digestive tract and the central nervous system stop working properly, and in a few weeks you're dead.
And very few people have died from acute radiation poisoning.
That's right. You can do experiments on dogs and you can give them as much radiation as you want and can see what the effect is and what doses run into serious trouble. And so one can get really quite a good fix. So there's quite good data on dogs that have been given radioactivity every day of their lives. And the question is, how much radiation do they have to be given before their life is shortened, for whatever reason, for cancer, for heart disease, and so on. And it's a very large dose indeed.
Let's get to the topic of units. They talk about effective dose and actual dose, and they also talk about the rate. But does that describe dose?
You asked exactly the right question. The question is not how much the total dose is, but how hard you hit it per hour or per day with radiation. And so it's the high acute doses that kill people. So it's the rate of radiation dose which is what damages people. Now, that is strictly speaking measured in grays. And then there's a unit called the sievert, which is derived from that, where you pretend or you treat the radiation dose, not the dose rate, they treat the radiation dose as if it's equivalent measure of the damage that is done. You don't measure the damage, you can't do that. If you stick with grays, a gray is the deposit of 1 joule of energy per kilogram. And you can get it straight into watts for the rate.
Right. You speak about sunlight having a certain wattage. I guess you'd have to have the ways of measuring it would be watts are damaging. How many watts are damaging?
Well, in the case of sunlight and ultraviolet, you can do that. And you tell children not to go out in the sunlight at midday when they're not used to it and without cream on, and they learn. Now, if we could learn, if people learned to be sensible with nuclear radiation the way they are with ultraviolet, which is almost the same thing because ultraviolet is right next to the X-rays in the spectrum of radiation, and it causes cancer and cell death when you have serious sunburn and your skin comes off. That is exactly the same kind of thing that radiation does. It's less effective at doing it, which means that you can stand much more radiation from ultraviolet than you can from X-rays and gamma rays. But it's the same kind of thing. The difference is that we're sensible about it. We don't have a United Nations committee which says what you can sunbathe today. What we do with nuclear is just about as stupid as that.
Sunbathing is actually more damaging than living next to a nuclear plant.
Well, 9,000 deaths from skin cancer a year in the US, and it is much more serious. But that doesn't mean, say, we go and spend our summer vacations in a deep, dark hole in the ground where the radiation can't get at us. We go out and enjoy ourselves.
Can you describe what linear no threshold is? It's called LNT.
It's a guess. Let me put it this way. In physics, linear means that result of radiation is linearly related. So if you double the amount of radiation, you double the effect. 4 times as much radiation, you 4 times the effect. The damage that is initially done, the number of DNA molecules that are broken, is linearly related. If you put twice as much radiation on, you get twice as many broken molecules, or 4 times and so on. And if you want no broken molecules, you shouldn't put any radiation on. That means no threshold. It goes right the way down to 0.
So this is how I described it to people, is your body can tolerate it up to a threshold.
Yeah, because it's got a repair system. It depends on having the right repair enzymes and things to fix it up, to replace one cell with a new one. But if you hit it hard enough, it can't keep up.
I wouldn't mind adding something. All along the way, radiation levels on the planet have been growing lesser and less. Our bodies evolved to deal with it in various ways.
Biology is extremely complicated because it's 3,000 million years evolving a really sophisticated repair system. It's an interesting question looking back in the evolution of the Earth. It's certainly true that the radioactivity from the ground and from the natural uranium in the Earth, which is and the potassium in our 40 in our bodies, that has been getting slowly less and less. Biology has probably had to cope with quite a big range of radiation attacks. So it's not surprising, in fact, that the threshold for damage is in fact very high compared with the natural background radiation.
There must also be thresholds for things like cell phones. We have cell phone radiation, microwaves, I guess they are.
Well, that's microwave radiation, but as I say, that's only heat. That means that we can feel it. If it's hot, you move your hand and you get out of the way. But you're talking about much higher wattages than anything you can get from a radioactive source. One of my tutors at Cambridge said, radiation and nuclear are boo words. They're like the words you give to small children when they run and hide behind the chair. You've shouted boo to them. And that's the trouble. We've got frightened of this word. You can be damaged by an excess of almost anything. And nuclear radiation is not exceptional in that respect.
Can we ask Wade a little bit about his latest book, Nuclear is for Life?
Absolutely.
Well, Nuclear is for Life has included a deeper look at several of the things we've been talking about, and Goiânia, which I hadn't described before, but also the whole history of how the hell did we get ourselves into this ridiculous mess, and how are we going to get out of it? I guess there's another chapter there that should be more about eco-modernism, and that should perhaps have been added on to the end, this idea of decoupling the human activity from the fate of the environment. I went back right and looked at philosophy and the sociology of Fukushima. These people get paid compensation. Now, when you start paying people compensation, or you start giving experts salaries to help them go on working on the LNT or something, you don't get the right answer. You start distorting the truth. Richard Feynman said that science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. I really like that. He got very unpopular with various people for saying it, but I think it's very important.
It can be read in a couple of different ways. We're growing less and less respectful of science, and we have various influences doing that, and it's political largely, and also economical because of profit motive and et cetera. That we're led to believe that the scientists are often under the influence and we can't be trusted, which raises a whole new topic about how does the average person find out or interpret what they're getting on a web page or a broadcast, whether they can believe the person speaking, presenting the information.
There's nothing scientific about this. As soon as somebody's compensation or their salary and their livelihood and their mortgage depends on a particular set of beliefs, they can't really, or they don't really change their mind. Now, it's very laudable that there are a small number of people who have changed their minds, the people who made Pandora's Promise and so on. But most scientists are not in a position to look into this and to change their minds. And I mean, I'm retired, and that is wonderful because I now can say what I think needs to be said.
The idea of pseudoscience becoming on a even par with science, I think that needs to be discussed a little bit, because pseudoscience is just a word, but I mean, it refers to a number of areas that don't have as much of a discipline.
There's an awful lot of science, so-called science, particularly in the biological fringes and so on, particularly around what people have found at Chernobyl and so on, where there is no mechanism behind it, but they need to publish something, they need to get another grant. It's fundraising. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard. So one's got to ask where people are coming from and why they're saying the things that they're saying and who are they. And there's another thing that's quite interesting. I find if you look at the language that people use, if people use scary language and they try to frighten people, that's a very, very bad sign. So if you use really cool language, say what needs to be said, because people are much more likely to buy it, because the people who are just themselves frightened and want to get you frightened too, that is is where a lot of the pseudoscience comes from.
Right. The idea that food is irradiated. They use that term, irradiation. Irradiate. A lot of people, if they knew that, might not want to eat the food they get.
Well, if you shine radiation on something, it can bust up molecules, but it does not make anything radioactive. The nuclei are not affected. So fire is dreadful because fire, it can catch and spread and make more and more fire. And that's why fire is particularly dangerous. And the same with biological infection. It's contagious, right?
Right.
Radioactivity is not contagious. The total amount of radioactivity actually gets less as time goes by. It can't multiply. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and after Chernobyl, and after Fukushima, the number of people who were affected by the radiation, because they had burns and so on, and people ran away from them and avoided them and shunned them and ostracized them because they thought they would catch the radiation from them.
That's amazing, yeah.
The most wonderful thing that anybody could do would be to educate people. The word education does not seem to appear in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. Why not?
So we need some actual spokespeople that can go out there and educate. I'm a layman, but at least I know the issues. You yourself are even better, of course.
So when we're trying to persuade the public to have some confidence in these solutions, they've got to be aware that they've actually been living and benefiting from the proper manipulation of this for a long time. When the medics give radiation to kill cancer cells, they give an amount of radiation. They know the amount of radiation that's going to normally kill the cancer cells, and it's not too much that it normally will give rise to new cancers. So they're quite used to judging exactly where that sort of boundary is. And they do that every day in every hospital up and down the land. And it's about 5,000 or 7,000 millisieverts or milligrays or whatever you like to call it.
I think what's fascinating about our bodies in dealing with radiation is that the DNA repair is something that goes back evolutionary, and that DNA repair is a natural thing that can actually be stimulated and by some theories, and that's where the word hormesis comes into play.
That's right. Well, I don't think that's very important from the point of view of safety, but I think it's very important from the point of view of cancer treatment, because if you can stimulate people's repair mechanisms, you can make them proof against cancers that come from any other cause as well. And it may be why people go and have radioactive baths and go to spas and things, as they've been going for decades, and coming away and saying they feel healthy. People go to fashionable spas in Germany and Japan and all the places where they're most afraid of radiation, and they feel happy and better after they've done it. Now, that may be just because they've got away from home and had a holiday, but maybe not.
For the listeners who don't know, hormesis is the term for favorable responses to low exposures of low-level radiation, as in low levels of radiation might even be beneficial. Do you think that there is enough scientific evidence to support hormesis?
In principle, yes, but there's not enough to be able to use it as well as we need to be able to use it if you're going to use it for preventing people getting cancer. So I think there's a lot more work to be done.
We just have a few more questions we were going to ask you, and we were wondering, concerning Chernobyl and Fukushima, if there's any evidence of increased cancer other than thyroid.
Well, there's no evidence of thyroid cancer that I'm aware of. And, well, I'm not a cancer doctor, obviously, but from those who are, I understand that, like many cancers, including prostate, for instance, that there are early conditions which can be diagnosed nowadays, and if you go and look for things, you can find them. But that doesn't mean to say that those people would have eventually got cancer. So, as I understand it, there is no evidence for an increase in the rate of thyroid cancer, and nor would you expect there to be, because in Japan they have an iodine-rich diet, because they eat seaweed in particular, so that they don't have the iodine deficiency that they did around Chernobyl. Some of them took iodine tablets when the accident occurred, and anyway, there was nothing like the amount of iodine released. Radioactive iodine, it's only got an 8-day half-life, so the load on the repair and replacement system that we were talking about is particularly high. Even at Chernobyl, there were 6,000 cases of cancer, some of whom would have been there would have occurred anyway, and as I understand it, there were 15 fatalities. For a cancer condition, that's pretty small.
Thyroid cancer has like a 99% cure rate. So when it comes to things like meltdowns, which wouldn't really occur with the newer technology that's out there, should there be an evacuation? Because oftentimes evacuation kills more people than potential radiation.
Yeah. Well, I think in the case of Fukushima, they probably should have evacuated people when they didn't know how big it was. Within a couple of weeks, as soon as there was measurements of the radioactivity released, and it was obviously less than Chernobyl, everybody should have gone home. And when I went out there and spoke to mayor, the community leaders and the schoolmasters and so on, and they said nobody came and talked to them. All they do is parade around in gas masks and protective suits and go and dig up kids' playgrounds. If people see that the parents feel they have to keep the children inside all the time, they can't go out to play, and everybody gets more and more upset and so on, it's very, very bad for the community. And the old people who were evacuated, many of them died because you can't uproot old people and just move them out suddenly. You've got all the professional people, the experts in the IAEA, and these people. I mean, I don't know exactly how many committees there are with responsibility for nuclear safety in the world, but all of them are incredibly self-important, and they've all got big budgets and career commitments and so on, and they don't like our message because it queers their pitch.
That's a good point, really. We got people in our own industry that are blocking us from sharing this information. Yeah,
I mean,
amazing.
I mean, the industry is indulging in the equivalent of digging latrines and then filling them in again, and all it can do is talk about decommissioning nuclear power plants and dealing with nuclear waste instead of building the bloody things.
I want to thank Professor Wade Allison for joining us. You gave us some really good insights. I think there's even room for another show with you, and we could perhaps explore some other things. Is there any concluding remarks you'd like to make, Dr. Allison?
No, I'd like to thank you very much. I think we've touched on quite a lot. I would like to encourage people, everybody, to read. There's so many things that we have not understood, however expert we thought we were. And I have the most difficulty in getting people to read what I've written. But any comments that people may have on what I've written, I've been very happy to hear.
I'd like to thank you for coming, Dr. Allison, and it was a pleasure for sure.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
And that does it for our show today.
This has been the Eco-Modernist Podcast. If you have any criticism, comments, or suggestions, please email them to ecomodernistpodcast@gmail.com. I'm Phil Ord.
And I'm Rick Maltese.
We will be leaving you till next time.